Hey, I'm Taylor Dorsett, and this is the Professional Technical Interviewee. Technical interviews are hard, and every company does them differently. On this show, I interview engineering leaders to see what they look for in technical candidates, and then they perform a real technical interview with me. My guest today is Nik Patel. He's the CTO and co-founder of Cohesion. He's also formerly been a senior software engineer and lead engineer at a number of companies. We talk about what he's looking for in a senior software engineer at his growing tech startup.
Well, we are back, Nik. I know the goal here is less the normal technical interview, live technical interview that I normally do on the show, and more insights into what does it take to be a senior software engineer at a growing startup, right? So I think, Nik, we talked about basically a situation where if you were interviewing at Cohesion, this is a real type of question you would get, and then essentially the follow-up interview, right, that would happen after you've turned in that coding example, right? Assuming that things went well, and what are the insights and types of questions that you're looking for someone to be prepared to answer, right, in that interview?
Yeah, definitely. So normally the process would be doing the introductions. We have already gone through about an hour of discussion, so we'll skip that part. And then I do want to dive right into just a very broad idea of the coding challenge itself. It is creating the API. So for a particular functional problem, and submitting that API as a coding challenge. And then we take it from there and have a discussion. So to set the stage, in this case, Taylor has already submitted the API. I had a chance to look at the code in general and deemed that the coding was done well. And we are starting the technical interview at that point. So normally, like I said, we do come in prepared, right? So a few things that I did notice was you used all get, put, post, and delete point. There were two get points, one for getting a particular resource, and second was getting a list. That was good. It is pretty common for us to see both, so that was a good design. Loved that. I also loved that you did some sort of unit testing. I totally see that it's probably not complete, and I can understand why, because of time constraints. Totally fine, but loved that you did focus on that area of the whole thing. And then for data persistence, it was a flat or JSON file. Makes sense. It would be a full-blown data storage of some kind in production. Totally good. Just going through that, I'm curious about how did you go about setting from problem all the way to coming through solution, and just walk me through your thought process.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so I think that this is one example, right, of a potential branching question to get insights into someone's actual steps they would take, right? And remind me, it's basically 2-3 hours is what you're assuming someone would take on this.
Yeah, so normally it's between 2 to 3 hours. Again, different teams have a bit of different challenges, but we do want to respect candidates' time, and we want, while there is an extra like bonus challenge that if you're like really interested into it, you could get into. We are totally fine just saying if you did not get the full solution, still submit. You can submit it based on time clock or whenever you feel comfortable.
Yeah. Great. So assuming that we got this challenge, and I'm assuming the type of answer you're expecting as well. I received it, I looked through it, and my first step was I need to build these, obviously the get and post requests, right, that I know are going to be involved in this, because I'm assuming they're laid out in the criteria.
Yes.
And then I went about testing that in some way, right? At least setting up those, testing that using Postman or something, just to make sure that I get a response, right? Something like that. What else are you looking for in someone's kind of design steps?
One thing that is important is, did they give me an instruction on how am I going to set up that coding challenge, right? It could be as simple as 4 steps. For example, let's say it's a Node.js or .NET Core, right? Clone your repo, do npm install, run and npm start, and off you go, right? It's going to run on localhost 3000, and here's the Postman collection. It could be as simple as that. .NET Core, just clone, run Visual Studio, hit start, and it's going to work, right? Either way, was there some sort of a documentation that explains what I should be doing? Mm-hmm. Not necessarily because I don't know what I should be doing, but more so, do you think of documentation for your future self or your peers, right? That is important. So we look for that. We have had instances where and this is something that's pretty common of me, especially I still do iOS side of the coding challenges to this date. The first thing I look at is that a senior person? Yes. I see there is a test project, but it's empty. Why? Right?
Sure.
And it is for some reason it is common. Not as much on the backend side, but I have seen that much on the iOS side. And that's my first question back before we even set up this next interview. Depending on the answer normally becomes, I did not have time. Okay, I know you did not have time. Fine, let's actually talk. So when we get into it, my first question becomes, I see that you did not get to testing. How would you have approached it? Right? So that in itself gets us into thought process and making sure that the person actually thinks about testing. If it's not, that's a big red flag.
Yeah, great. So again, some of this stuff you're not necessarily looking for it all to be there in the coding challenge. At least mention it, right? I think I mentioned this in interviews. Sometimes you can kind of hand wave things away. Like, this is what I would do, right? If I had more time. Yeah. Sometimes that's all you have to say, because the interviewer goes, okay, I know that you understand this concept, right? So therefore, I don't necessarily need to interview you on it. Or they might go, okay, yeah, let's talk more in detail about that, right? But at least if you write it in the documentation, if I had more time, I would do X, Y, and Z. I think that gives you a starting point for a lot of conversations, right?
Exactly. And also at that point, you gotta come prepared on that one, right? Because you have already established that. It's like, that's gonna happen, right? More so what it does is it gets you in flow in first 5 to 10 minutes, where you're like nervous and don't know the person and all that. Because you're talking what you already know or you already came prepared for, you get into your natural self. And from there on, it's hopefully much more fluid, right? So we do start with something where we can hit the ground running on a common problem set, common understanding. The second thing that we look into, especially during the conversation, is how much can you relate to this into your own experience, right? Not necessarily that you know the tech, but how did you end up implementing that? Knowing tech is one thing, implementing that is another, because there's always some sort of learning experience there. So how do you go about doing that? And you being able to talk about, oh, I had done that. There was a time where GraphQL is all about, you always return 200, and I did not like it. Well, for the record, I did not like that of GraphQL technical setup, where everything's 200. I don't know what to expect. So I need to go parse my messages. Versus with REST APIs, I know if status code is 400, validation went wrong, 500, server went down, whatever, right? So just having some sort of that discussion as a senior is what we look into is, can you actually relate to your own experience?
Yeah, and if someone doesn't necessarily have that experience, I think being upfront about that is the goal, right? If they say, I touched on this a little bit at work, but basically I kind of Googled my way through setting up this piece, right? So I don't have a ton of experience there, right?
Yeah, totally fine. Especially when folks come from big companies, we have seen that. So in startup, this is pretty common, where you are wearing multiple hats, right? You are getting into, I'm building an API. Well, what about CI/CD? I don't know how to do it, but I'll put a week aside and we'll figure it out, right? It's pretty common. Versus when folks are coming from big companies, it normally starts with, we had a whole DevOps team that handled it for us. Fine. Yeah. It's totally fine, right? Pretty common for some of the teams I have been part of. It has been the case, right? But I did not deal with deploy, or not at least setting up the deploy or setting up the compliance or any of that. can you relate to, we had a DevOps person, I worked with that person, and that person did the work, so I did not know what they did, but I was part of it. Or no, we did not touch that for XYZ reason, and I don't know about that, but I would love to learn that. Or no, that's not my focus, I still want to keep going this path. It's totally fine. Like I said, it's one of the things where you don't know, right? We'll see if that's something you are interested in, and as a startup, we have options. We'll just basically put you on some of those items too, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we would do that. That, like I said, would go on for about 10 to 15 minutes, introductions and some early discussions about your program solutioning. That's when the time comes, and we had at that point we have a pretty good idea in terms of how deep you are generally going, right? Mm-hmm. So the first couple of questions gives us a quick glance over, per se, to say, all right, I was going to go deep all the way into authentication. Well, you talked about it like 5 minutes out of 10 minutes, so I don't need to touch that anymore. Sure. You are going to use OAuth 2 and JOT tokens, and you know how scopes and claims work and things like that. So the first question at that point would be, all right, security, great. Have you worked with compliance? So as Cohesion, we have to work with certain compliance standards. In this case, we are just SOC 2 compliant from a Cohesion standpoint, but we are looking into others as we grow into compliance from a data governance standpoint or security standpoint. So have you worked with that? No, that was not necessarily part of our thing. Fine, good to know. Let's table that, move on to next thing, right? So we would do that. One of the most important thing as a senior is functionally you can solve a problem. Normally that's not where rubber meets the road problem, right? Generally that goes pretty well. We get into non-functional side of things is when it starts to show how, and again, depending on the team, it might differ, right? So if you're going on one of our teams that is focused on building features, the discussion would much more become on the validation, negative test cases, understanding how would you handle performance and things like that. Mm-hmm. Versus if you're going on the platform side of things or integration side of things, the discussion would much more become, what if you lost a connection? How would you do a retry policy? How would you focus on making sure that you are not waiting 30 seconds before responding back to UI, because then UI is just stuck and not know what to do. Is that a design problem? Should we work with product to say, I do not want to wait for 30 seconds and I can't do anything about this, right? So let's come up with a UX solution. At that point, it's not even a tech problem, right? But do you see that as a senior person, do you see that an embed that has been part of your process is pretty critical to us? So we would get into non-functional. That non-functional would be, depending on your team, that non-functional criteria actually shows, you have had that experience where you have run production systems. You know what it takes to run something in a production system, right? It's easier to create POC. It's easier to develop. It's hard to maintain. Can you create a maintainable code?
Yeah, got it. That makes a lot of sense. And again, same things apply where if you've done that, obviously share that experience. If you haven't done that, how close have you been to that? And then if you don't know at all, right, being upfront about that, right?
Exactly. And sometimes it just simply becomes, hey, I do not get to work with our design team as much. Generally, I get a functional requirement spec doc. Pretty common for on the consulting side, depending on, again, what consulting firm you're in. There are like business development teams and other teams that has done a lot of work up front. So by the time it gets to you, it's a very well laid out document that says, I need this feature developed and here's everything you need to do. And you go like, good to know. I understood 90% of it and I just developed it. And it's fine too, but just knowing that from a startup world, that is not the case. With startup, you are working with your product really close. In fact, you know what customers are actually yelling right now, right? Because and we have few folks where when support tickets come in, we know those people pretty heavily, and us being in this smart building world, we can actually walk up to them, walk test in the building, right, in the physical world. So we, as a senior in a startup world, you get to see not only the software development lifecycle, you get to see business lifecycle, right, on how things went from a simple idea to ideation to some sort of a iteration into delivery and maintenance. You get to see all of that all the way from end-to-end customer. So did you have that experience? If so, awesome for us. If not, are you willing to go that far? If you're not, maybe there is a different team that is not interfacing with customer, and we would recommend you for that. Or if you are wanting to do that, well, we'll throw you right in and have fun.
And when you say non-functional, you mean basically something outside of, I have very clear laid out steps and instructions for me to code. It's more, how do we get from that? I like everything from, we've got a something, right? We know we need this, and how do we make that into an actual workable ticket, right?
Exactly. The normal questions that seniors would ask is, oh, this is great. I totally get what you're wanting to do. What happens when this fails? What sorts of message am I supposed to show? You are asking me for example, you're asking me for a zip code. Well, good to know. US zip codes are 5 digits and actual digits, right? Canada zip codes are alphanumeric characters, and something else is something different, right? So from a design standpoint, when I design my data structure, how am I going to go about it? Am I going to say it's a country and then just a zip code, so we have a validation? Or am I going to let the person put anything and I'm going to accept that, right? So these are the questions that normally we would get into. This is when it's attention to detail matters, right? Yeah. It's already laid out, you need to handle zip code. Great. What happens when it fails? What sorts of message am I showing? Is it something that's going to be only front-end validation or back-end validation as well, right? You get the idea, but that's where we get deeper into, oh, you think through this. We want that. And the more you solve it up front, the more it's clear up front and discussed up front, you save a lot of time in coding.
Sure. Absolutely. As the person who gets tickets right now that sometimes have all those details and sometimes don't, right? It certainly saves a lot of time if we could skip all the back and forth, or at least skip some of it, right? I might have 3 follow-up questions instead of 30, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Great.
Exactly. So we would go through those. This is the technical side. Normally, a technical interview is anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour. Sometimes it goes longer depending on how good the conversation's going.
Sure.
So about 30-minute mark, we switch gears a little and would focus on, well, this is great. If you're coming in as an individual contributor or you aspire to be lead, either way, about half of the software problems are people problems, genuinely, right? So how would you go about working with your team? So let's switch gears and say, all right, we have come out with this good solution. Obviously, this is a bigger thing that we have to get done this sprint, so you're not the only one working on it. You have some sort of another senior peer or junior colleague working with you. How would you go about working with them? And it's not necessarily asking how would you go, right? It's just simply a junior person that is going to take up a ticket. What sorts of help you would provide them? How would you mentor them? Things like that is where we would get into discussion. This is when we talk about delivery, quality, understanding understanding that once the code is ready, do we have a plan on how it gets to production, right? When it needs to get to production, or things like that. Through this discussion, we also, and this one question that we ask up front and really like early in the process is, have you worked with globally distributed teams across different time zones? That is critical for us. If you have not, are you willing to do it? Because we do that pretty often, right? It's in the software industry, and in about 95% cases, the answer is yes. I have had some sort of an exposure to that, right? As a senior, how would you go about working through those teams? How do you set up your asynchronous communication? How do you make sure that it's not always a burden versus a help, right? So we would get into those discussions. We would get into, do you have a good communication strategy in terms of how do you work with other folks? That would go on about for, I'd say, 10 to 15 minutes, and where it is not necessarily a people problem, but it is the solutioning aspect of it. When you are in the solutioning aspect, people are obviously part of the thing, right? So how do you work with team? Do you work with multiple teams already? If you do, that's good, because we have cross-functional teams that works with each other from time to time.
And are examples of things you'd be looking for basically, I'm, right now we have offshore QA and we use, Jira for actual ticketing. We'll Slack during our overlapping hours. And then we make sure that we always have, handoff emails whenever we're switching from US based to whatever their time zone may be, right? So that they're able to hit the ground running. And we have set times where you're supposed to be available for support, or what are you looking for? That in detail, or?
So for us, we have 8 a.m. to about 12 p.m. Central as our core hours. This is the time where all teams across the world are working together, right? So we have at least half a day per se as an overlapping hours. What we look for is when you have experienced this, especially for about a year or more, you know the things that matter. The cultures are different. The languages and the accents are different, right? You understand that. You understand that it takes time to start working as a team, right? So how would you go about setting that up? And the folks that have done that, the answer normally comes out to be, yes, we have done that. We ran into this problem in the beginning and we ended up solving that in few sprints. Or as part of our retros, something kept coming up, and then we just made that part of our whole thing as our team fabric, and then we solved for it. There's always some sort of an example that we get to see. It's not necessarily this is how we do it and you need to know that, because obviously you don't, but more so what sorts of exposure you had and how did you solve that problem too.
Yeah, great. That's helpful. And real quick on the initial kind of technical conversation, right? There was a couple paths you touched on of where that questioning might go, right? Like authentication or security, testing, right? Is there any other, possible branches as a senior person that you should be coming in expecting to be asked about, or things that are important, right? To at least have some knowledge about, or hopefully have some knowledge about?
Yeah, if you're coming in on the backend side, you are dealing with APIs pretty heavily. We are microservices architecture, which means anything that is exposed is either exposed through an API call or publishing and subscribing into Service Bus, right? Those are the things where we have APIs have outward endpoints, connections. When you look into that, things that matter, the one that matters a lot is obviously logging. How do you log and how do you debug? I strongly believe this. What makes you senior is your ability to debug. You always run into a problem. You always run into issues. How do you go break that down into very small chunks and get to a actual root cause and then solve that? Yeah. It's 80% of time is actually getting to that point, and then once you know, it's pretty straightforward, right? Or in most cases, it's straightforward. So knowing logging performance, asking questions of, all right, we are publishing an event, we are subscribing an event, how do we go about doing that? Just knowing the details of those sides of things are important. For what it's worth, we have a big initiative internally that we are focusing on in terms of stabilizing some of our logging, standardizing that, putting coding practices together. Senior people coming in, we would expect them to contribute to that, right? So that is something that keeps coming up. On the flip side, let's say your front end, iOS, etc. Same thing matters. What happens if my API call failed from server? Those things are pretty common, right? How do you go about logging that and things like that? But at that point, the discussion also goes on the design side. What is your attention to detail on the UX? What is your attention to detail on the design? How are you building your components? How are you setting up the libraries so you can update them? Things like that. Those things do matter. On the mobile side, same thing, right? So in general, there are things that from a senior standpoint, you always know functionally you can meet all the requirements, but as a developer, there are things that are not called out by non-technical folks, and as a senior member, you are the one establishing that. So how far do you go in establishing those items?
Yeah, great. And I think you also mentioned on deployment, right, and actual delivery, right? That's an important piece, and sometimes it's tied into the team setting, right? Of like how would you set that up, but also how would you just go about setting that up, or what has worked well for you in the past? I'm sure as part of that conversation or potential strands. So great. So it's that more kind of technical branching, then more people focused, right? Of like more communication, really, right? The senior leadership, people stuff you're thinking of, and then what else are you looking for?
Hopefully, this far the conversation was conversational. We had good discussion. Like I said, it is expected that you do not know everything. It's totally fine. Let's say we went through the whole conversation. We do want to give you some time to ask questions. And we have seen everyone from like, no, I don't have any questions. It's like, okay, good to know, and then there is a list of like people just literally pull out notepad and it's like, I have a list of questions. Let's go through that, right? We have seen both. And obviously, you coming in prepared and showing that you have a list of questions helps. Even in cases you did not, part of the conversation always had something that you could touch back on and say, oh, that was a pretty good one. Did not want to break our flow, but let's actually talk more. It could be as simple as that. So giving candidates some time to ask their question and understanding what matters to them. It is critically important for us to understand what matters to them as much as it's important for them to understand what matters to Cohesion. So going through that process and giving them some time in terms of ask the questions, things like that. We would go through that. Normally interview ends on a good note to say, all right, we'll circle back, or no, this is good. We're just going to set up a next interview, whatever it may be, right? What happens after that internally is we have notes from all the candidates through different rounds that we look into. So there would be a discussion internally to say, all right, you are the next one. I like this thing. I did not get to XYZ, so maybe touch on that. Or I did get into XYZ, was good. You are clear, right? So focus on anything else that you want to focus on. So internally, us preparing for it before you come in again. And same on the other side, right? So we would go through those items, both working with the candidate as well as internal. And assuming everything goes well, we get into offer stage and then candidate join us.
Nice. Well, great. As far as types of questions, I encourage everyone, like if you don't have any time to prepare, right, you can always have 5 questions, just standard questions you ask every company, right? Fall back on those. Have them open in an email, like you said, on a notebook, piece of paper or something if it's in person. Are you open to talking with candidates? I know some people, they obviously want to know about funding, right? Because if it's a startup, that's something that they think about, right? But I think sometimes they worry, if I'm asking about funding, am I asking about the right things, right? Do you encourage people to ask at this stage those types of questions, and how in detail? Some companies are really willing to share their financial situation. Some companies maybe not as much. I guess, what's your opinion on that?
So, especially when it comes to me, generally that question I highly recommend. It's one of those things. If it's on your mind, right, why not ask? Because if you don't ask now, you will still have that question at the offer stage or later, right? If you are making a big decision in your career point, and we want you to have details, as much details as we can provide to you. So definitely ask those questions. For senior folks, we have seen that question come up pretty regularly is, hey, you are a startup. I see your journey. What does your financial stability situation looks like, right? And we would definitely want to provide information as like, yeah, I mean, simply just when you look at the growth, it's like, okay, man, it's probably fine, right? But definitely ask that question. To Taylor's point, if you are going through an active interviewing, or even for that matter, passive interviewing, know what you want. I will say the startup life is really different in a sense that with more responsibility, power come more responsibility, right? It's as a senior engineer in a startup, you have an ability to influence quite a few decisions because team is small, everyone knows each other, you're not always talking software, right? And know that if that matters to you. If it does, ask those questions, right? We know few people care about coming into a startup. The discussion point always is, startups always working 80 hours a week. It's like, no, that's not necessarily the case. Maybe very early in the days, right? But as you go from a startup mode to a scaling mode into growth and then stabilization mode, things change. So know what matters to you and at least ask those questions. If it's not even company specific, at least you can get a good idea in terms of the process.
Yeah, great. Well, anything else that you're looking for? Anything else people should keep in mind if they're a senior engineer going into tech startup interviews?
Yes, again, if you're going into a startup, depending on where startup is in its journey, know that there will be different stages. Sometimes the growth comes too quick, and one thing that has always stayed with me, I think about a job or two ago, my VP used to say, "Get comfortable being uncomfortable." That's just a startup.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's something that comes with being a senior engineer as well in general, right? As an early career engineer, sometimes you're often given the same types of tasks so you can continue to be successful. And once in a while, you get something that pushes you a little bit versus if you're the senior or the lead engineer at a small company, even larger company, sometimes it's every week is the new hairy thing you've got to figure out how to solve, right? And that's, I think at a startup, that's kind of everyone's job, right? At least early on, right?
Yeah. So yeah, that I think goes a long way of knowing you're getting into something that may not feel natural. You're out of your comfort zone, and it's okay, right? That's how growth comes, and that's how you learn something. If learning is what's important to you, I would highly recommend startups.
Yeah, great. Well, I think that's a great note to end on, Nik. Anything to plug? It sounds like Cohesion hiring quite a bit.
We are hiring for all positions, front end, back end, mobile, platform, DevOps, everywhere on multiple stacks. So we are on Microsoft ecosystem, having .NET Core APIs hosted on Azure. As data stores, it's either SQL, Postgres, Neo4j, Timescale, etc. Us being an IoT startup. And then on the programming languages, Scala, Node, etc. So if you're looking, definitely hit us up.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being on the show, Nik. It's been fantastic. And I think a lot of interesting insight into folks who are, maybe a little bit more senior in their career who are going, how do I get out of the bank and go work somewhere interesting? Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Great. All right. Well, you have a good rest of your day.
All righty. Thanks, Taylor. Have a good one.
Thank you for watching the technical interview portion of the Professional Technical Interviewee. If you want to tackle this interview question, you can find it at github.com/professional technical interviewee. New episodes are released on the first 4 Thursdays of each month. Find us on YouTube at youtube.com/Taylor Dorsett or on Apple Podcast or Spotify. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on new episodes. And remember, keep practicing.